After I became a widower, my daughter sent me a message. You're not getting a single cent from Mom's inheritance. My husband is more of a man than you. At the inheritance meeting, I was humiliated by my son-in-law, but when the lawyer read the clause, I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I was folding Margaret's sweaters when the message came through. 3 days. That's how long it had been since I buried my wife of 35 years, and I was still moving through our house like a ghost, touching her things, breathing in the faint scent of her lavender perfume that clung to everything. The funeral flowers were wilting on the kitchen counter, and I hadn't had the heart to throw them away yet. My phone buzzed on the dresser. Isabella's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment my chest loosened. Maybe she was calling to check on me. Maybe she wanted to come over and help sort through her mother's belongings. Maybe she realized how alone I felt in this house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. But it wasn't a call. It was a text. You're not getting a penny of Mom's inheritance. My husband is more of a man than you ever were. I read it once, twice, 3 times. The words didn't change. My hands started shaking, and I had to sit down on the edge of the bed where Margaret and I had slept together for over 3 decades. Isabella. My little girl who used to climb into this same bed during thunderstorms, who would beg me to read her just one more story before bedtime. The daughter I worked double shifts for, the one I drove to every dance recital and soccer game, even when I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. That Isabella had just told me I wasn't man enough to deserve my own wife's inheritance. I stared at the phone screen until it went dark, my reflection staring back at me. 63 years old, gray hair that Margaret used to trim for me every month, lines around my eyes from years of working construction in the sun. I looked tired, I felt tired, but I had never felt this hollow before, not even when the doctor told us Margaret's cancer was spreading. The house creaked around me, settling into the evening quiet. I could hear Mrs. Patterson next door calling for her cat, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. Normal sounds of a normal Tuesday evening, but nothing felt normal anymore. I walked downstairs to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, staring at the casseroles neighbors had brought over. Nobody tells you that when your spouse dies, people assume you don't know how to feed yourself. Margaret had always done most of the cooking, but I wasn't helpless. I wasn't the helpless old man Isabella apparently thought I was. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Isabella. Frank and I will be at the lawyer's office Thursday at 2 p.m. Don't bother showing up. This is just a formality. Frank, my son-in-law of 8 years, the man who had swept Isabella off her feet with his expensive suits and fancy car. The man who called me Pops in that condescending way that made my skin crawl, who always had something to say about how I should be handling my finances, my health, my life. I remembered the last family dinner we'd had, just 2 weeks before Margaret passed. Frank had been going on about some business deal, throwing around numbers like they meant something to me. When I mentioned that I was thinking about finally retiring from the construction company, he'd laughed. Retire on what, Pops? You've been working that same job for 30 years. What do you have to show for it? Margaret had tried to change the subject, but the damage was done. Isabella had just sat there, nodding along like Frank was making perfect sense. Like the man who had raised her, who had sacrificed everything for her future, was some kind of failure. I walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up our wedding photo. Margaret looked so young, so happy. She was wearing the simple white dress we'd bought at a department store because we couldn't afford anything fancy. I was wearing my father's suit, altered to fit me. We looked poor, I suppose, but we looked happy. What would you want me to do, Maggie? I whispered to the photograph. How did we raise a daughter who could be this cruel? The silence that followed felt like an answer in itself. Margaret had always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over family tensions. When Isabella went through her rebellious teenage years, Margaret was the one who talked her down from her anger. When Isabella struggled in college, Margaret was the one who drove 3 hours every weekend to bring her care packages and encouragement. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe I had relied too much on Margaret to maintain my relationship with our daughter. Maybe I had become invisible in my own family without even realizing it. I thought about Thursday, about sitting in that lawyer's office while Isabella and Frank divided up the life Margaret and I had built together. The house we'd bought when Isabella was 5, scrimp and saving for the down payment. The small savings account we'd managed to build despite all the years of living paycheck to paycheck. The life insurance policy I'd insisted on, even when money was tight, because I wanted to make sure Margaret would be taken care of if something happened to me. It had never occurred to me that Margaret might go first. It had never occurred to me that my own daughter would try to cut me out of everything we'd worked for. But as I stood there in the gathering darkness, still holding that wedding photo, I realized something else. Margaret had been acting strange in those last few weeks. Not just sick strange, but secretive. She'd made several phone calls that she'd ended abruptly when I walked into the room. She'd asked me questions about things she already knew, like when we'd bought the house, when we'd opened our joint savings account. And she'd insisted on meeting with the lawyer alone, just 2 weeks before she died. Said it was to update her will, make sure everything was in order. I'd offered to come with her, but she'd kissed my cheek and said she could handle it herself. At the time, I'd been grateful. The cancer treatments had left me exhausted, and dealing with legal paperwork felt overwhelming. But now, thinking back on it, I wondered what exactly Margaret had been planning. My phone buzzed one more time. This time, it wasn't Isabella. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Henley, this is David Morrison from Morrison & Associates. I was your wife's attorney. Could you please call me at your earliest convenience? There are some matters regarding Mrs. Henley's estate that we need to discuss before Thursday's meeting." I stared at the message for a long time. Margaret's attorney wanted to talk to me about matters we needed to discuss? But Isabella had made it clear that I wasn't supposed to be part of Thursday's meeting at all. Standing there in my empty kitchen, surrounded by wilting flowers and casseroles I didn't want, I felt the first spark of something that wasn't grief or hurt. It was curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, it was hope. Margaret had always been smarter than people gave her credit for. Maybe in those final weeks, she'd been planning something none of us expected. I called David Morrison first thing Wednesday morning. I'd spent the night tossing and turning in the bed that still smelled like Margaret's shampoo, wondering what her lawyer could possibly need to discuss with me. By 6 a.m., I gave up on sleep and made coffee, sitting at the kitchen table where Margaret and I had shared breakfast every morning for 35 years. "Mr. Henley," David's voice was gentle but professional when he answered. "Thank you for calling me back. I know this is a difficult time, but there are some aspects of your wife's will that I think you should understand before tomorrow's reading." "Isabella told me not to bother coming," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. There was a pause. "Mr. Henley, I sent the notification letter to all beneficiaries, including you. You absolutely should be there. In fact, your presence is required." Required. The word hung in the air like a lifeline I hadn't expected. "I don't understand," I said. Isabella made it clear that everything was going to her and Frank. Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Henley, I think it would be best if we met in person before tomorrow's reading. Would you be available to come to my office this afternoon?" I agreed to meet him at 2 o'clock, then spent the morning walking through the house like I was seeing it for the first time. Really seeing it. The living room where Isabella had taken her first steps. The kitchen where she'd done homework at the counter while Margaret cooked dinner. The hallway lined with school photos and family portraits that chronicled our life together. We hadn't been wealthy, but we'd been happy. Or at least I'd thought we were. I stopped at Isabella's old bedroom, now converted into Margaret's sewing room. The walls were still painted the soft yellow Isabella had picked when she turned 16. She'd wanted something more mature than the pink roses she'd loved as a little girl. I remembered painting those walls, how excited she'd been about the change. She'd helped me move furniture and lay down plastic sheets, chattering about her plans for redecorating. When had she stopped seeing me as someone worth talking to? When had I become just an inconvenience in her life? The truth was, I could pinpoint exactly when things started to change. It was when Isabella met Frank. She was 25 then, working as a receptionist at a dental office, living in a small apartment across town. She'd been dating a nice young man named Ryan, someone she'd met at church. Margaret and I liked him. He was quiet, respectful, and he genuinely seemed to care about Isabella's happiness. Then Frank came along. He was 32, drove a BMW, and worked in commercial real estate. He took Isabella to expensive restaurants and bought her jewelry that cost more than I made in a month. Within 6 months, she'd broken up with Ryan and moved in with Frank. I should have been happy that she'd found someone successful, someone who could provide for her in ways I never could. But something about Frank rubbed me wrong from the beginning. The way he talked down to waiters, the way he always found a reason to mention how much money he made, the way he looked at our modest house like he was slumming it. "Your dad's a hard worker," he'd said to Isabella during one of their first visits after I'd mentioned putting in overtime to pay for a new roof. "Old school, you know. Some guys just aren't built for bigger things." Isabella had laughed like he'd made a joke, but there was something in her eyes that told me she was starting to see me the way Frank did, as someone small, someone limited. Over the years, Frank's influence on Isabella became more obvious. She stopped calling just to chat. Our weekly family dinners became monthly, then only on holidays. When she did visit, she always seemed restless, checking her phone, making comments about how we needed to update this or that in the house. "You and Mom should really think about downsizing," she'd said last Christmas, looking around our living room like it was some kind of burden. "This place is way too big for just the two of you, and frankly, the maintenance costs must be killing you." Margaret had shot me a look across the room, one of those wordless conversations married couples have perfected over decades. She was as hurt as I was, but neither of us said anything. We just let it slide, the way we always did. David Morrison's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, all dark wood and leather-bound books. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Henley," he said, standing to shake my hand. "First, let me say how sorry I am for your loss. Your wife was a remarkable woman." "Thank you. She spoke highly of you, too." He gestured for me to sit in one of the chairs across from his desk. "She did speak about you quite a bit, actually. She was very proud of you, you know." The words hit me unexpectedly hard. I had to clear my throat before I could respond. "She was proud of everyone. That was just Margaret." "No," David said gently. "She was specifically proud of you. She told me about how you worked double shifts when Isabella was in college, how you never complained about the sacrifices you made for your family. She said you were the strongest man she knew, even though you never demanded credit for it." I felt my eyes burning. Margaret had said that to her lawyer. David opened a folder on his desk. "Mr. Henley, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Has Isabella or her husband suggested that you might not be included in your wife's will?" I told him about the text messages, about Isabella's directive not to come to the reading. David's expression grew grimmer with each detail. "I see," he said when I finished. "Mr. Henley, your wife came to see me 3 times in the month before she passed away. She was very concerned about your relationship with Isabella, and particularly about Frank's influence on her." "What kind of concerned?" David leaned back in his chair. "She told me that she'd overheard some conversations between Isabella and Frank that troubled her deeply. Conversations about your financial situation, about their expectations regarding inheritance. She was worried that Isabella had developed some very unrealistic and frankly inappropriate assumptions about what would happen after Margaret's death." My stomach sank. "What kind of assumptions?" "The kind that suggested Isabella believed you wouldn't be a factor in inheritance decisions, that she and Frank would essentially take over the management of everything you and Margaret had built together." I thought about Frank's comments over the years, his subtle suggestions that I wasn't capable of managing my own affairs, the way he'd started offering unsolicited advice about my retirement planning, my health care decisions, my finances. "Margaret was quite upset about it," David continued. "She said she felt like she'd failed both of you by not standing up to Frank's influence earlier. She was determined to make sure that didn't happen after she was gone." "What did she do?" David smiled, and for the first time since Margaret died, I felt something that might have been hope. "She made some very specific provisions in her will, Mr. Henley. Provisions that I think will surprise everyone tomorrow, including Isabella and Frank." He pulled out a thick document. "Your wife was much more strategic than anyone gave her credit for. She saw exactly what was happening to your family, and she decided to do something about it." As I sat there in that quiet office listening to David explain Margaret's final gift to our family, I realized that my wife had been protecting me one last time. She'd always been the one who stood between me and the world's harshness, and somehow, even in death, she was still doing it. Tomorrow's meeting was going to be very different than Isabella expected. I arrived at David Morrison's office 5 minutes early on Thursday afternoon. My hands were sweating as I walked up the front steps of the Victorian building. I'd barely slept the night before, David's words echoing in my head. Margaret had made specific provisions. She'd seen what was happening to our family. She'd been protecting me. But knowing that didn't make walking into that conference room any easier. The receptionist, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, smiled at me sympathetically. "Mr. Henley? They're waiting for you in the conference room. Down the hall, last door on the right." I could hear voices before I even reached the door. Frank's voice, specifically, loud and confident as always. "The old man probably won't even show up," he was saying. "Margaret always said he couldn't handle stress well. Probably for the best, honestly. These kinds of meetings can be overwhelming for people his age." I paused outside the door, my hand on the handle. People his age. I was 63, not 93. I still worked construction full-time, still lifted heavy beams and climbed scaffolding, but to Frank, I was just some doddering old fool who couldn't be trusted with important decisions. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped inside. The conference room was elegant but stuffy, with a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. Isabella sat at the far end, looking perfectly put together in a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Frank sat beside her, wearing one of his expensive suits. Checking his phone like this whole proceeding was just an inconvenience in his busy day. David Morrison sat at the head of the table with several folders and documents spread out in front of him. When I walked in, he stood and smiled warmly. "Richard, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Isabella looked up from her phone, and I saw surprise flash across her face. She hadn't expected me to show up after all her messages. Frank barely glanced in my direction, just gave me a dismissive nod like I was some neighbor who'd wandered into their private business meeting. "Pops," Frank said without looking up from his phone. "Didn't think you were coming. Isabella said you were pretty broken up about all this legal stuff." There it was again, that tone that made me feel like a child being humored by adults. I sat down across from them, folding my hands on the table. "Margaret was my wife for 35 years, I said quietly. "I think I can handle a simple will reading." Frank finally looked up, that smirk I'd grown to hate playing at the corners of his mouth. Sure. Of course you can, Pops. It's just that Isabella and I have been handling most of the family's financial planning lately anyway. Margaret always came to us when she needed advice about investments, insurance, that kind of thing. That was news to me. Margaret had never mentioned going to Frank for financial advice. If anything, she'd always been skeptical of his flashy lifestyle and constant bragging about money. "She did?" I asked, looking at Isabella. My daughter shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Well, you know how Mom was. She didn't want to burden you with all the details. Frank has experience with estate planning and investments. It just made sense for her to get his input." David cleared his throat. "Actually, Mrs. Henley handled all of her estate planning directly through this office. She never mentioned consulting with anyone else about these matters." Frank waved his hand dismissively. Right. I meant more general financial questions. You know how women get overwhelmed by all the technical stuff. Margaret was always calling Isabella, asking her to have me explain things to her. I felt heat rising in my chest. Women get overwhelmed? Margaret had balanced our household budget for 35 years, managed our mortgage payments, handled our insurance claims, and kept track of every penny we spent. She was one of the most financially savvy people I'd ever known. Margaret wasn't overwhelmed by financial matters, I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. She was perfectly capable of handling our affairs. Frank laughed. Actually laughed. Come on, Pops. I'm not saying she wasn't smart, but there's a difference between balancing a checkbook and understanding real financial planning. Estate taxes, investment strategies, asset protection, that's complicated stuff. Frank has an MBA, Isabella added, like that settled the matter. He's been helping us plan for the future. Us. Like she and Frank were a unit separate from me, like I wasn't part of any future they were planning. David Morrison had been listening to this exchange with an increasingly grim expression. Now he opened the folder in front of him and pulled out a thick document. Well, he said, his voice carefully neutral, I think we should proceed with the reading of Mrs. Henley's last will and testament. Frank leaned back in his chair with the satisfied look of someone who was about to get exactly what he expected. Isabella smoothed her dress and folded her hands, trying to look solemn but failing to hide the anticipation in her eyes. I just sat there, feeling smaller by the minute, wondering if David had been wrong about Margaret's provisions. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe I really was just an old man who didn't understand how the world worked anymore. Before I begin, David said, I want to make it clear that this will was prepared entirely by Mrs. Henley, with no input or influence from any family members. She was very specific about wanting her wishes to be clearly understood by everyone present. He began reading in that formal legal tone lawyers use. I, Margaret Rose Henley, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. The standard opening language seemed to go on forever. Frank kept checking his phone, occasionally whispering something to Isabella that made her nod or smile slightly. They looked like people waiting for a formality to be completed so they could get on with more important business. Finally, David reached the meat of the document. To my beloved daughter Isabella, I leave my jewelry collection, including the pearl necklace that belonged to my mother and the contents of my hope chest. Isabella smiled and squeezed Frank's hand. Personal items, but nothing of real financial value. To my son-in-law Frank, I leave my gratitude for making Isabella happy, and my hope that he will continue to cherish and respect my daughter as she deserves. Frank's smile faltered slightly. That didn't sound like someone leaving him a substantial inheritance, but he recovered quickly, probably assuming the real assets would be coming next. David paused, looking directly at me across the table. To my beloved husband Richard, who has been my partner, my support, and my greatest love for 35 years. Here it comes, I thought, the part where Margaret leaves me some small token while giving everything important to Isabella and Frank, the final confirmation that I really was just a side character in my own family's story. But David's next words stopped my heart. I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including our family home, all bank accounts, investment portfolios, and life insurance proceeds. Frank's phone clattered onto the table. Isabella's mouth fell open. However, David continued, and I could hear the slight smile in his voice. This inheritance comes with one very specific condition. The room was dead silent now. Even the traffic noise from outside seemed to have stopped. The condition is as follows. Isabella must remain married to Frank for a minimum of 1 full year following my death. Should their marriage end before that time, for any reason including divorce, separation, or annulment, the entire inheritance will instead be donated to the American Cancer Society. Frank shot to his feet so fast his chair toppled backward. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Isabella was staring at David like he'd spoken in a foreign language. I don't understand. Why would Mom put a condition like that in her will? David set the document down and looked at both of them with the kind of calm professionalism that comes from years of delivering difficult news. Your mother was very clear about her reasoning, he said. She wanted to ensure that your marriage was based on genuine love and commitment, not financial convenience. Frank's face was turning red. Financial convenience? Are you kidding me? I don't need Isabella's inheritance. I make more money than this whole family combined. Then the condition shouldn't be a problem, David replied smoothly. I sat there in stunned silence, watching my daughter and son-in-law realize that their carefully laid plans had just crumbled. Margaret hadn't just protected me. She'd seen right through Frank's motives and found a way to expose them. But as the shock began to wear off, I started to understand something else. Margaret hadn't just been protecting our assets. She'd been protecting Isabella too, in the only way she knew how. The question was, what exactly had my wife discovered about Frank that made her take such drastic measures? The silence in the conference room stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Frank was pacing behind his overturned chair, his face flushed with anger. Isabella sat frozen, staring at the will in David's hands like it might change if she looked at it hard enough. This is insane, Frank finally exploded. Margaret was clearly not in her right mind when she wrote this. The cancer, the medications, they obviously affected her judgment. We can contest this. David Morrison's expression didn't change. Mrs. Henley underwent a comprehensive mental competency evaluation just 2 weeks before she passed away, at her own request. The results clearly show she was of sound mind and fully capable of making legal decisions. My head was spinning. Margaret had anticipated this reaction. She'd planned for Frank to challenge the will, and she'd protected against it. Isabella finally found her voice. I don't understand why she would do this. It's like she didn't trust us. Maybe she had good reason not to, I said quietly. Frank whirled around to face me. What's that supposed to mean, old man? The contempt in his voice was so naked, so undisguised, that even Isabella flinched. But something had shifted in me during the reading of that will. Margaret's final gift hadn't just been financial. It had been the knowledge that she'd seen everything clearly, that my instincts about Frank had been right all along. It means Margaret was a lot smarter than you gave her credit for, I said, standing up slowly. And she saw exactly what kind of man you really are. Frank took a step toward me, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't know anything about me, you pathetic old—" "Frank," Isabella's voice cracked like a whip. "Stop it." She was staring at her husband with something that might have been recognition dawning in her eyes. Maybe she was finally seeing what Margaret and I had seen all along, the real Frank, the one who emerged when he didn't get his way. David cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take a break. This is obviously a lot to process." "No," Isabella said firmly. "I want to understand. Mr. Morrison, why did my mother really put that condition in her will? There has to be more to it than just testing our marriage." David glanced at me, then back at Isabella. "Your mother left a sealed letter for your father. She asked me to give it to him after the will was read. Perhaps that will provide some answers." He reached into his folder and pulled out an envelope with my name written in Margaret's careful handwriting. My hands trembled as I took it. She also left instructions that if anyone wished to contest the will, certain additional information might become relevant to the proceedings. Frank's face had gone from red to pale. "What kind of additional information?" "The kind that your wife collected over the past 6 months," David said quietly. "Phone records, photographs, financial documents. She was quite thorough." The air seemed to have been sucked out of the room. Isabella was staring at Frank with growing alarm, and he was looking like a man who just realized he'd walked into a trap. "Frank," Isabella said slowly, "what is he talking about?" Frank's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I don't know what he means." "Your mother was obviously paranoid. Maybe the cancer had spread to her brain or something." But his voice lacked conviction, and Isabella wasn't buying it anymore. I looked down at the envelope in my hands. "She knew, didn't she? Whatever you've been hiding, Margaret figured it out." "I'm not hiding anything," Frank snapped, but his voice pitched higher with desperation. David Morrison stood up. "I think it would be best if Mr. and Mrs. Collins took some time to discuss this privately. Mr. Henley, perhaps you'd like to read your wife's letter in my office?" I followed David out of the conference room, leaving Frank and Isabella alone with their crumbling facade. Through the closed door, I could hear their voices rising. Frank's defensive, Isabella's increasingly shrill with panic. David's office felt like a sanctuary after the tension of the conference room. He poured me a glass of water and sat down across from me. "Your wife was an extraordinary woman," he said. "In all my years of practice, I've never had a client plan so carefully for something like this." "You knew what she was doing?" "Not the details," David admitted. "But she made it clear that she had discovered something about Frank that deeply concerned her. She spent weeks planning how to handle the situation without destroying Isabella in the process." I turned the envelope over in my hands, afraid to open it. "What did she find?" "I think you should read her letter first," David said gently. "Then I'll tell you what I know." With shaking fingers, I tore open the envelope. Margaret's handwriting filled 2 pages, and even though she was gone, seeing her words felt like having her in the room with me one more time. "My dearest Richard," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then David has read the will, and you've seen Frank's true reaction to not getting what he expected. I'm sorry you had to witness that, but it was necessary for Isabella to see it too." I paused, wiping tears from my eyes. Even in death, Margaret was still trying to shield me from pain while forcing me to face difficult truths. I discovered something about Frank 6 months ago that broke my heart, not just because of what it revealed about him, but because of what it revealed about how far our daughter had fallen under his influence. My hands were shaking as I continued reading. "I found out Frank has been having an affair for over 2 years, with a woman named Cheryl who works at his real estate office. But that's not the worst part, Richard. The worst part is what I overheard when I confronted him about it." The next paragraph made my blood run cold. "He laughed when I told him I knew about Cheryl. He said he was just waiting for me to die so he could divorce Isabella and take half of everything we'd worked for. He said Isabella was too stupid to see what was happening, and that you were too weak to protect her even if you did figure it out. He called our daughter his meal ticket and said once he had access to our assets, he'd be done with the whole family." I had to stop reading. The cruelty of it, the calculated coldness, was more than I could process. Frank hadn't just been cheating on Isabella, he'd been planning to destroy her life the moment Margaret was gone. "I know this will hurt you to read," Margaret's letter continued, "but I needed you to understand why I structured the will the way I did. The 1-year condition isn't really about testing their marriage. It's about giving Frank enough rope to hang himself. I know him well enough to know he won't be able to keep up the act for 12 months, not when he can't access the money he was counting on. The final paragraph brought fresh tears to my eyes. I'm sorry I never told you about Frank's true nature while I was alive. I was trying to protect Isabella, but I realize now that I was really just protecting myself from having to face what our daughter had become. You were right about him from the beginning, Richard. You always are about people. I should have listened to you. I should have trusted your instincts instead of hoping things would get better. Take care of our daughter when this all falls apart. She's going to need her father whether she realizes it now or not. I love you. Forever, Margaret. I sat there in David's office, holding my wife's final words, finally understanding the full scope of what she'd orchestrated. She hadn't just protected our assets. She'd set a trap that would expose Frank's true nature to Isabella in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. Did she tell you about the affair? I asked David. He nodded grimly. She brought me documented evidence, phone records, hotel receipts, photographs. She also recorded a conversation she had with Frank where he admitted his plans. And Isabella doesn't know any of this? Not yet. Your wife wanted her to discover it naturally. When Frank's mask inevitably slipped, she believed that was the only way Isabella would truly understand what had happened to her marriage. Through the office door, we could hear raised voices from the conference room. Frank's defensive anger and Isabella's growing distress. Margaret's prediction was already coming true. The door to David's office burst open, and Isabella stumbled in, her face streaked with tears. Behind her, Frank looked like a cornered animal. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in years. Beneath the expensive clothes and perfect makeup, I could see the scared little girl who used to run to me when thunderstorms frightened her. "What do you want to know, sweetheart? Did Mom ever say anything to you about Frank? About problems in our marriage?" I glanced at Frank, who was watching this exchange with barely concealed panic. Then I looked back at Isabella, Margaret's letter still clutched in my hands. "Yes," I said quietly. She did. Isabella sank into the chair across from David's desk, her composure finally cracking completely. "What did she tell you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank moved behind her chair, placing his hands on her shoulders in what looked like a supportive gesture but felt more like a warning. "Isabella, honey, you're upset. Maybe we should go home and talk about this privately." "No," Isabella said firmly, shrugging away from his touch. "I want to know what Mom said. Dad, please." I looked down at Margaret's letter, then back at my daughter. This was the moment Margaret had been preparing for, the moment when Isabella would finally be ready to hear the truth. "Your mother was worried about your marriage," I said carefully. "She thought Frank might not have your best interests at heart." Frank let out a harsh laugh. "This is ridiculous. Margaret was sick, Richard. The cancer, the pain medication. She wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. You know that. She was thinking clearly enough to have herself evaluated for mental competency," David interjected, "and clearly enough to hire a private investigator." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Isabella's face went white. "A private investigator?" she repeated. Frank's hands clenched into fists. "You're lying." "Margaret would never." "She would," I said quietly, "if she suspected her daughter was being deceived by someone she loved." David opened another folder on his desk. "Mrs. Henley retained the services of Wilson Investigations for 3 months before her death. She was very specific about what she wanted them to document." Isabella turned to stare at Frank, and I could see the exact moment when pieces started falling into place in her mind. "That's why you've been working late so much. That's why you've been taking all those weekend trips to check on properties." "Isabella, don't listen to this," Frank said desperately. "They're trying to turn you against me. Can't you see that? Your father has always resented our relationship. He's probably been planning this for years." But Isabella wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at David. "What did the investigator find?" David glanced at me and I nodded. Margaret had wanted the truth to come out, and this was how it had to happen. "Evidence of an ongoing extramarital relationship," David said professionally, "dating back approximately 2 years and 4 months. The sound Isabella made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Frank moved around to face her, dropping to his knees beside her chair. "Baby, let me explain. It's not what you think. It was just what?" Isabella's voice was sharp now, anger cutting through the shock. Just a mistake? Just meaningless? Just something that happened to go on for over 2 years? It meant nothing, Frank said frantically. You're the one I love. You're the one I married. Cheryl was just— Cheryl? Isabella stood up so abruptly that Frank fell backward. Cheryl from your office? The one you said was just a colleague? The one who's been calling the house and hanging up when I answer? Frank's face crumpled as he realized his mistake. He'd given away more than the investigation had revealed. How long have you known? Isabella demanded, turning to me. How long has everyone known while I've been walking around like an idiot? Your mother only found out 6 months ago, I said gently. She didn't tell me until she was dying, and even then she made me promise to let you discover it in your own time. My own time? Isabella laughed bitterly. She put a condition in her will that would force us to stay married for a year. How is that letting me discover it in my own time? David cleared his throat. Actually, there's more to the condition than what I read in the conference room. Isabella and Frank both turned to stare at him. The condition isn't just about staying married, David continued. It's about staying married faithfully. If either party commits adultery during the 1-year period, the condition is considered breached, and the inheritance goes to charity. Frank went completely still. That's not what you said before. I read the primary clause, David said calmly, but there are several subclauses that provide additional detail. Your wife was very thorough, Mr. Henley. I felt a surge of admiration for Margaret's planning. She'd known Frank would never be able to resist continuing his affair, especially once he realized he couldn't access the inheritance immediately. So if Frank has been cheating this whole time, Isabella said slowly, then the condition has already been breached. According to the documented evidence, yes, David confirmed. Frank shot to his feet. This is entrapment. This is some kind of conspiracy between all of you. Margaret was obviously not competent when she wrote this will. Actually, David said, reaching for another document, your wife anticipated that argument as well. She left very specific instructions about what should happen if anyone contested the will or claimed she was incompetent. He pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. She left this with instructions that it should only be opened if her mental state was questioned, or if someone tried to challenge the validity of her decisions. Isabella looked at the envelope like it might contain a snake. What's in there? I don't know, David admitted. She sealed it herself and told me it contained insurance against anyone trying to undermine her final wishes. Frank was backing toward the door. I don't have to listen to this. Isabella, we're leaving. Now. But Isabella didn't move. Open it, she said to David. Isabella, no, Frank pleaded. Whatever's in there, it's just going to hurt you more. Don't you think you've been through enough today? Open it, Isabella repeated, her voice stronger now. David broke the wax seal and pulled out several items. A USB drive, a stack of photographs, and a handwritten letter with Isabella's name on it. Isabella took the letter with trembling hands, while David inserted the USB drive into his computer. The screen filled with a video file, a recording of a conversation that was clearly taking place in our kitchen. I recognized Margaret's voice immediately, though she sounded tired and weak. She must have recorded this just weeks before she died. Frank, Margaret's voice said through the computer speakers, I know about Cheryl. Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. On the screen, we could see Frank sitting at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared hundreds of family dinners. I don't know what you're talking about, Frank's voice replied, but he looked nervous even in the grainy video. The hotel receipts in your car, Margaret continued. The phone calls, the way you've been treating my daughter like she's some kind of burden instead of your wife. Frank's expression on the video changed, becoming cold and calculating. So, what if I am seeing someone else? What are you going to do about it? Tell Isabella. She'll never believe you over me. Maybe not, Margaret said quietly, but she'll believe the evidence. Frank laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. Margaret, let me explain something to you. I married Isabella for one reason, and it wasn't love. It was access. Access to this family, to your assets, to the comfortable life you've built. Do you really think I'd waste my time with your pathetic daughter if there wasn't something in it for me? Isabella made a choking sound and dropped the letter. Frank on the video was still talking, oblivious to how thoroughly he was destroying himself. I've been planning this for years, he continued. Waiting for you to die so I could finally get what I deserve. Isabella's too stupid to manage money anyway. She needs someone like me to take care of her finances. And after you have access to our money? Margaret's voice asked. Frank shrugged. Then I won't need to pretend anymore, will I? Isabella can find herself a nice little apartment somewhere and learn to live on whatever alimony I decide to give her." The video ended, leaving the office in complete silence. Isabella was staring at the blank screen, tears streaming down her face. Frank was pressed against the door like he was trying to disappear through it. "Isabella," he started, his voice cracking. "That was taken out of context. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean." "Get out," Isabella said quietly. "Baby, please." "Get out," she screamed, and I saw the fury that had been building finally explode. "Get out of this office, get out of my life, and don't you ever come near me again." Frank looked around the room desperately, as if searching for someone who might help him. His eyes landed on me, and for a moment I saw real fear there. "Richard, you know I didn't mean those things. You know I care about Isabella." "The only thing I know," I said, standing up slowly, "is that my wife was right about you from the very beginning. And now my daughter knows it too." Frank's shoulders sagged in defeat. Without another word, he opened the door and walked out, leaving Isabella sobbing in the chair and the rest of us in stunned silence. Margaret had orchestrated this moment perfectly. She'd known that Isabella would never believe accusations against Frank, but she'd also known that Isabella would have to believe Frank's own words spoken in his own voice. My wife had given our daughter the gift of truth, painful as it was. Now it was up to me to help Isabella figure out what to do with it. 6 months later, I was sitting on the front porch of our house, my house now, watching Isabella tend to the garden Margaret had planted years ago. The divorce had been finalized just last week. Frank had tried to fight it at first, demanding alimony and a share of assets he'd never been entitled to. But David Morrison had made it very clear that the video recording, combined with the private investigator's evidence, made Frank's position untenable. In the end, he'd taken what little he could get and disappeared, apparently moving to another state with Cheryl. Isabella looked up from the rose bushes and smiled at me. It was a real smile, the first genuine one I'd seen from her in years. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by jeans and one of my old gardening shirts. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she looked more like the daughter I remembered from her childhood. "Mom always said these roses needed more attention than she could give them," Isabella said, wiping dirt from her hands. "I never understood why she kept trying with them." "Your mother was stubborn that way," I replied. "She believed in nurturing things back to health, even when everyone else thought they were beyond saving." Isabella sat down on the porch steps beside my chair. We'd been having these quiet conversations more often lately, slowly rebuilding the relationship that Frank had spent years undermining. "Dad," she said softly, "I owe you an apology that's about 8 years overdue." I shook my head. "You don't owe me anything, sweetheart." "Yes, I do." Her voice was firm but gentle. "I let Frank convince me that you were weak, that you weren't capable of making important decisions. I believed him when he said I needed to protect Mom from your financial incompetence. I was so stupid." "You weren't stupid," I said. "You were manipulated by someone who was very good at it." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. It was the kind of peaceful moment that had become precious to me since Margaret's death. Quiet time with my daughter, no tension, no hidden agendas. "I found something yesterday," Isabella said, reaching into her pocket. "I was going through some of Mom's old jewelry boxes, and I found this." She handed me a small envelope with my name written on it in Margaret's handwriting, another letter, one that David Morrison hadn't mentioned. "Where was it?" I asked. "Hidden in the bottom of her jewelry box under the lining. Like she wanted to make sure I'd find it eventually, but only after everything else had been settled." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small brass key. "My dearest Richard," the letter began, "if Isabella is reading this with you, then everything has worked out the way I hoped it would." I felt that familiar ache in my chest that came whenever I encountered Margaret's words. Even 6 months after her death, I still reached for the phone sometimes to call her, still woke up expecting to find her beside me. "I know the past few months have been difficult for both of you," the letter continued, "but I needed Isabella to understand what Frank really was before she could appreciate what you really are." Isabella leaned closer to read along with me. "Richard, you have spent 35 years being the strongest man I know, even though you never demanded recognition for it. You worked double shifts without complaining. You put our family's needs before your own dreams, and you loved us both unconditionally, even when we didn't deserve it. I had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion. Isabella, your father is not weak. He is not incompetent. He is not any of the things Frank convinced you he was. Your father is the kind of man who builds a life through quiet dedication rather than loud boasting. He is the kind of man who shows love through actions rather than expensive gifts. I hope that by the time you read this, you've remembered why you used to think he was the strongest person in the world. Isabella was crying now, silent tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. The key, Margaret's letter concluded, opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box 247. Inside, you'll find the real legacy I want to leave you both. Not money, but memories. All the things I saved over the years that I thought you might want to remember when I was gone. Take care of each other. You're all the family you have left now. Love always, Margaret. Isabella took the key from my trembling fingers. Do you want to go look at it now? I nodded, not trusting my voice. An hour later, we sat in a small private room at the bank, surrounded by the contents of Margaret's safety deposit box. She'd saved everything: school photos of Isabella, report cards, awards from my construction company for safety records and long service. There were ticket stubs from movies we'd seen together, pressed flowers from our anniversary dinners, even the hospital bracelet from the day Isabella was born. But what hit me hardest was a small notebook filled with Margaret's handwriting, page after page of moments she'd wanted to remember. Isabella's first words, the day she learned to ride a bike, her high school graduation speech, my promotion to foreman, the night I stayed up all night when she had pneumonia, the morning I brought her coffee in bed every day during her first round of chemotherapy. She wrote down everything, Isabella whispered, flipping through the pages. Every birthday, every holiday, every little thing we did as a family. Near the back of the notebook, I found an entry dated just 3 months before Margaret died. Richard fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen today. He's been promising to do it for weeks, but I know he's been putting it off because he's afraid of making it worse. He spent 2 hours on a 10-minute job, taking everything apart and putting it back together 3 times. When he finally got it working, he was so proud of himself. He didn't realize I was watching from the doorway, seeing the same expression he had when Isabella took her first steps. He's always been so careful with the things he loves, so determined not to break them. I wish I had told him that he's never broken anything that mattered. I closed the notebook, overwhelmed by the weight of all these preserved moments. Margaret had been documenting our life together, creating a record of love that Frank had tried to convince Isabella didn't exist. Dad, Isabella said quietly, I want you to know something. These past 6 months, living here with you, helping you sort through Mom's things, it's been the happiest I've been in years. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. The brittle sophistication Frank had encouraged was gone, replaced by something softer and more genuine. Moving back home wasn't just about saving money after the divorce, she continued. It was about remembering who I used to be before Frank convinced me I needed to be someone else. And who are you? I asked. Isabella smiled, and I saw my little girl again in that expression. I'm your daughter. I'm Margaret Henley's daughter. I'm someone who knows how to work in a garden and cook Sunday dinner and appreciate the man who spent 35 years taking care of his family without asking for credit. We packed up Margaret's treasures carefully, planning to spend the evening going through them together. As we drove home, Isabella reached over and took my hand. I know I can't undo the way I treated you, she said, but I want you to know that I see you now, really see you. Mom was right. You are the strongest person I know. That night, we sat in Margaret's old kitchen, eating the pot roast Isabella had learned to make from her mother's recipe. The house felt full again for the first time since Margaret died, not because we'd replaced what we'd lost, but because we'd remembered what we still had. After dinner, Isabella showed me something else she'd found among Margaret's things, a letter addressed to both of us, dated just days before Margaret passed away. My darling family, it read, by the time you read this, you'll have discovered that Frank was not the man we hoped he was.
Isabella, I'm sorry you had to learn that truth in such a painful way, but I knew it was the only way you'd believe it. Richard, I'm sorry I didn't trust your instincts about him from the beginning. The letter went on to explain Margaret's final wishes, not the legal ones that had been in her will, but her personal hopes for our future.
I want you to take care of each other, she'd written. Not because you have to, but because you choose to. I want you to remember that family isn't about perfection or success or impressing other people. It's about showing up for each other, especially when things are difficult. She'd ended with a request that made both of us cry. Don't mourn me forever. Honor me by being happy together. As I sit here now, 1 year after that terrible day in David Morrison's office, I can honestly say we've done what Margaret asked. Isabella and I have built something new together, not trying to recreate the past, but creating a future that honors the love Margaret left behind. Frank tried to contact Isabella once, about 3 months ago. He'd apparently ended things with Cheryl and wanted to work things out. Isabella listened to his voicemail message, deleted it, and never mentioned it again. She's dating someone now, a teacher named Michael who coaches Little League and drives a 10-year-old Honda. He treats her with genuine respect and kindness, and when he looks at her, I can see real affection there, not calculation. Margaret's plan had worked perfectly. She'd protected me from Frank's manipulations, saved Isabella from a destructive marriage, and given us both a chance to rediscover what we meant to each other. But perhaps most importantly, she'd taught us that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in demanding respect, but in quietly earning it. Not in grand gestures, but in daily acts of love. Not in fighting for your place in someone's life, but in being so steady, so reliable, so genuinely caring that they can't imagine their life without you. That's the kind of man Margaret saw when she looked at me. That's the kind of man Isabella is learning to see too. And that's the kind of man I finally understand I've always been, even when I couldn't see it myself. Margaret gave me one final gift, not money or property, but the knowledge that I was loved and valued exactly as I was. In the end, that turned out to be the most valuable inheritance of all. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. Until here.